By 7:30, Lower Brindleford had already agreed, without discussion, that something was wrong. This agreement was not reached through any formal exchange of information. It passed instead through posture and pause. A longer than usual stop at the bakery counter, a greeting left hanging unanswered outside the post office, the way Mrs. Ellery, who had lived above the chemist for 37 years, stood quite still while pretending to rearrange the postcards by the till. The village possessed a refined sense for disturbance. It did not require drama. A faint irregularity would suffice. The irregularity, as it happened, lay on a breakfast table in Ashley Cottage. Miss Dorothea Fenn had taken her tea as usual, strong with a slice of lemon, no sugar, and buttered her toast with her customary precision. She had then unfolded the morning paper, scanned the local notices and reached, without looking, for the second piece of toast. It was only then that she noticed the envelope. It lay beside her plate, aligned carefully with the table edge, as though it had always been there. The paper was thick, cream-coloured, unmarked by stamp or postmark. Her name had been written in a tidy, deliberate hand. Miss Fenn did not touch it at once. At 72, she had learned the value of delaying reaction. Experience had taught her that the first impulse, to open, to read, to respond, was rarely the wisest. She sipped her tea instead, studying the envelope with an expression that was neither alarmed nor curious, but faintly reproachful, as though it had arrived without sufficient justification. No one ever delivered letters in the night. The last post passed through Lower Brindleford just before 4 in the afternoon, and the village prided itself on this reliability. Deviations were noticed, commented upon, quietly judged. Miss Fenn lived alone. She locked her door each evening at 9:30 after the weather forecast. She was certain of this. The lock had been replaced only last winter after the handle began to stick, and she tested it every night with a firm downward press, a habit she found reassuring. The envelope had not been there when she set the table. She opened it carefully, tearing along the edge rather than using the letter knife she kept for birthdays and formal occasions. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The message was brief. It contained no threats, no demands, no expressions of urgency. There was no signature, only a reference to a matter Miss Fenn had not discussed publicly or privately in more than 20 years, and a sentence suggesting politely that the time for silence had passed. Miss Fenn read it twice. Then she folded the paper again, returned it to the envelope, and placed both neatly beside her plate. She finished her toast. By 8 o'clock, she had put on her coat, taken her handbag, and stepped outside. She locked the door behind her, checking it once, then again. The morning was cool and unusually still. At the end of the lane, the postman was already making his way back toward the sorting van, his bag empty. Miss Fenn did not speak to him. She walked instead toward the village green, where the inspector had chosen to stand, hands clasped loosely. Behind his back, examining the notice board as though it were a source of mild but genuine interest. Inspector Purbright had arrived in Lower Brindleford the previous afternoon, without announcement and with minimal luggage. He had taken the spare room above the King's Arms, accepted the landlord's apology regarding the stairs, and asked, with some care, whether the bells from the church tended to ring at night. On learning that they did not, he had seemed faintly pleased. At present he was reading a faded notice advertising a whist drive long since concluded. "Inspector," Miss Fenn said. He turned at once. His expression when he saw her was attentive rather than surprised, as though he had been expecting her but had not wished to appear so. "Good morning," he said. "A fine day for early errands." Miss Fenn inclined her head. "I received a letter,"
Inspector Purbright considered this. So I understand. She looked at him sharply.
He smiled, not unkindly. Lower Brindleford is very good at understanding things before they are explained, he said. May I see it? They sat on a bench near the green, the envelope passing between them with quiet formality. Inspector Perbrite did not open it immediately. He examined the paper, the writing, the absence of marks. No stamp, he observed. No, Miss Fenn agreed. And no reason. Reasons, he said mildly, are often present even when they decline to introduce themselves. He read the letter once, then again, his expression unchanged. When he looked up, his gaze rested not on Miss Fenn, but on the green itself, the trimmed grass, the war memorial, the path worn faintly by years of cautious feet. This was delivered after midnight, he said. Yes. And it concerns a matter you would prefer remained unremarked. I would prefer, Miss Fenn replied, that it remained in the past. Inspector Perbrite nodded. The past is a popular destination, he said. It rarely stays where one leaves it. A pair of women crossed the green, lowering their voices as they passed. One of them glanced toward the bench, then quickly away. The inspector waited until they were out of earshot. Did you hear anything in the night? He asked. No, nothing at all. I sleep lightly, Miss Fenn said, but not imaginatively. He
accepted this. And yet someone entered your cottage. She did not answer at once.
When she did, her voice was steady. Or wished me to think so. Inspector Perbright's smile returned faintly. That, he said, is a very sensible distinction. He returned the letter to her. For the moment, he continued, I suggest we do nothing. Miss Fenn looked at him. Nothing? Nothing visible, he amended. Lower Brindleford notices effort. It is less observant of stillness. She considered this, then placed the envelope back into her handbag. Well, she said, but I dislike being included in mysteries. As do most people, the inspector replied, which is why they so often find themselves in them. The church clock struck 8:30. Somewhere a door opened, then closed again with unnecessary
firmness. Inspector Perbrite rose from the bench. We shall speak again, he said.
Quite soon, I think. Miss Fenn watched him walk away toward the high street, his pace unhurried, his attention apparently divided between the paving stones and the quiet movements of the village around him. By 9 o'clock, everyone in Lower Brindleford knew that something had happened. No one yet knew what it was. Lower Brindleford conducted its mornings according to an unspoken timetable, one that valued appropriateness over efficiency. Certain actions belonged to certain hours, conversations likewise. Inspector Perbrite, who had spent much of his career observing such patterns, found them as instructive as fingerprints, though considerably more legible. By 8:45, the high street had settled into its proper rhythm. Mrs. Hargreaves unlocked the stationery shop, pausing to align the pens in the window. Mr. Cole, from the butcher's, swept his step with unnecessary force. The bell at the bakery rang at intervals that suggested both custom and impatience. It was, by all visible measures, an ordinary morning. The inspector stood outside the post office, watching the glass door reflect the street behind him. He did not enter. Instead, he waited, hands loosely folded, until the postman emerged from the rear, cap already removed, his expression one of cautious neutrality. "Morning," the inspector said. "Morning, sir." Inspector Perbrite inclined his head. "I wonder if you might clarify something for me." The postman hesitated, not out of reluctance but habit. In Lower Brindleford, clarification was rarely requested without consequence. "I've finished," My round, he said unnecessarily. So I see, the inspector replied. And you finished it yesterday, as usual, at just before 4? That's right. And you delivered nothing thereafter. The postman frowned, a crease forming between his brows. No, sir. Nothing after hours. Inspector Purbright smiled faintly. I thought not. The postman shifted his weight. If there was something— Oh, I'm sure there was, the inspector said gently. But not from you. He thanked the man and stepped aside as Mrs. Ellery entered the post office, greeting him with an expression that managed to be both polite and alert. She lingered longer than necessary at the counter, her attention divided between stamps and speculation. Inspector Perbrite moved on. At 9:30, he took a seat at the small table near the window in the King's Arms, where he ordered tea and observed the comings and goings with quiet interest. Miss Fenn did not appear. This did
not surprise him.
She was, he suspected, following his advice with some care. Instead, it was Mrs. Calder who approached, carrying her cup with the confidence of someone accustomed to being overheard. "Inspector," she said, settling opposite him without invitation. "You'll excuse me, but people are talking." He met her gaze calmly. "They often do." "Well," she continued, "there was the matter of the van last night." Inspector Perbrite raised an eyebrow. "What matter would that be?" asked. "Delivery van," Mrs. Calder said. "Late, very late. Parked by the Green just after midnight. Did you see it yourself?" "No," she admitted. "But my nephew did. He's home from university and keeps odd hours." "I see." He said it didn't look like any regular service. Inspector Perbrite nodded slowly. "Did your nephew mention anyone leaving the vehicle?" Mrs. Calder hesitated. "He said he thought he saw a figure, but it was dark." "Of course," she leaned forward. "If someone was delivering letters at that—"
They weren't, the inspector said mildly, "but thank you for telling me."
Mrs. Calder looked faintly disappointed, then recovered. "Well, I thought you should know." "I'm glad you did." She rose, leaving her tea untouched, and moved toward the door, pausing briefly to exchange murmurs with Mrs. Ellery. The inspector watched them go, his expression thoughtful. By mid-morning, the rumour had altered. The van became a car, the figure multiplied, the hour shifted forward, then back again according to preference. Inspector Perbrite listened to none of it directly. He preferred second-hand certainty to first-hand imagination. At 11, he called upon Mr. Edwin Marsh, who lived in a narrow house overlooking the lane behind Ashley Cottage. Mr. Marsh was a retired schoolmaster, precise in speech and fond of context. "I was awake," Mr. Marsh said, "but I heard nothing untoward." "Nothing at all?" the inspector asked. "Well," Mr. Marsh conceded, "there was a sound. A door, perhaps. But doors open and close." "Indeed." "And at night," Mr. Marsh added, "everything sounds more deliberate." Inspector Perbrite thanked him and stepped back into the lane. He stood there for a moment, looking at the rear of Miss Fenn's cottage. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn. Nothing suggested intrusion. Nothing ever did until it did. He returned to the high street shortly before noon, where Miss Fenn was examining apples at the grocer's with studied attention. She did not look up as he approached. "Good morning," he said quietly. She selected an apple, then another. "Inspector, I trust you are well?" "As well as can be expected," she replied. "Under the circumstances." He lowered his voice. "Several people believe they saw a vehicle last night." She glanced at him. "Several people believe many things." "Quite." She placed the apples in her basket. "If someone wished to be noticed," she said, "they would not have chosen such an hour." Inspector Perbrite considered this. "Unless," he said, "they wished to be noticed indirectly." Miss Fenn's mouth tightened. "By gossip." By suggestion, he corrected. There is a difference. They walked together toward the till. Neither spoke again. Outside, the bell from the church marked noon, clear and measured. Inspector Purbright paused on the pavement, watching Miss Fenn make her careful way home. The respectable hour had passed. Whatever followed would be less so. The afternoon arranged itself with deceptive calm. Sunlight settled on the green in a way that suggested cooperation rather than scrutiny, and Lower Brindleford responded by resuming its small, orderly motions. Doors opened, baskets were carried, remarks were exchanged that appeared incidental and were anything but. Inspector Perbrite spent the early part of the afternoon walking, not with purpose obvious enough to invite interruption, but with the measured curiosity of someone willing to be delayed. He paused at shop windows, crossed the road twice without clear necessity, and accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Langley, who lived opposite the chapel and observed the world from behind lace curtains of remarkable clarity. It was there, at her small kitchen table, that he heard the first explanation. "Oh, it's simple," Mrs. Langley said, pushing the sugar bowl toward him, though he had not asked. Miss Fenn must have misplaced the letter herself. People do that, you know. Then, when it turns up somewhere unexpected, they convince themselves it arrived by other means. Inspector Perbrite stirred his tea. "You believe she placed it?"
On her own breakfast table? Unknowingly, Mrs. Langley replied. One forgets things at night? Of course, he said. And the contents? Mrs. Langley waved a hand. Private matters have a way of resurfacing.
He thanked her sincerely and moved on. The second explanation presented itself an hour later outside the haberdashery, where Mr. Wilkes was examining a display of buttons with professional intensity. Mr. Wilkes had lived in Lower Brindleford for only 6 years and still retained the outsider's confidence in logical solutions. It was someone passing through, Mr. Wilkes said. A traveller, perhaps the van people mentioned. They saw a light, an unlocked door, and thought nothing
of it.
And chose to leave a letter, the inspector prompted. Yes, mistaken address, or curiosity. Inspector Perbrite nodded. And they knew what to write? Mr. Wilkes hesitated. Well, that is less clear. Still, the inspector said, mildly, it is a possibility. The third explanation arrived without invitation. Miss Fenn appeared at the King's Arms just after 4, earlier than her usual hour, and with no intention of staying long. She took a seat near the window, ordered tea, and waited until the inspector joined her. They think I imagined it, she said, without preamble. Some do, he replied. Others believe it was an outsider. And you? I believe, Inspector Perbrite said, that the letter was meant to be read exactly as you read it. She studied him. Which is? As a reminder, he said, and as a test. Her fingers tightened around the cup. Of what? Of whether you would speak. Miss Fenn looked away. Outside, the afternoon had begun to dull, the light losing its earlier generosity. There are things, she said carefully, that one chooses not to revisit out of courtesy. Courtesy, the inspector said, is often misunderstood. She met his gaze. You think I know who wrote it? I think you know who would benefit from its arrival. She was silent for a moment. Then, there are several, she said. 3? He asked lightly. She allowed herself a thin smile. At least. They finished their tea in silence. As Miss Fenn left, Inspector Perbrite remained by the window. He watched as she crossed the green, pausing to exchange a word with Mrs. Calder, who leaned in with interest that was almost affectionate. The inspector noted the angle of their heads, the brevity of the exchange, the way Mrs. Calder's expression sharpened afterward. By early evening, the explanations had settled into place, each favoured by a different corner of the village. None were defended with particular passion. Lower Brindleford preferred balance to certainty. Inspector Purbright returned to his room above the King's Arms as dusk approached. He placed his notebook on the desk but did not open it. Instead, he stood at the window, listening to the sounds of the street below. A laugh cut short, a door closed too firmly, footsteps that slowed as they passed the inn. 3 explanations, he reflected, all polite, all sufficient, all wrong in different ways. What mattered was not how the letter had arrived, but how carefully its arrival had been arranged, and, more importantly, how many people were waiting to see what Miss Dorothea Fenn would do next. Outside, the first steam light appeared in an upstairs window across the street, then another. Lower Brindleford was settling in for the evening, content in the belief that it understood itself. Inspector Perbrite did not share that belief. Evening drew itself across Lower Brindleford with a softness that discouraged decision. Curtains were pulled with care, kettles filled, radios adjusted to familiar voices. The village preferred conclusions that arrived quietly, and Inspector Purbright, aware of this preference, chose his movements accordingly. He began with the post office. It was closed, the blinds already drawn, but a light burned at the back, where Mr. Latham, the postmaster, was known to complete his accounts with a thoroughness that bordered on devotion. The inspector waited until the door opened of its own accord, Mr. Latham stepping out with his coat folded over one arm and a faint look of irritation at having misjudged the time. "Inspector," Mr. Latham said, recovering himself, "I didn't
expect." "No," Inspector Perbrite replied. "I imagine you didn't." They walked together a short distance, the inspector matching the other man's pace with deliberate ease. "I've spoken to your postman," the inspector said.
"He's quite certain of his deliveries." "As he should be," Mr. Latham replied. "We run a proper service here." "So I've observed." Mr. Latham cleared his throat. "If there's been some suggestion—" "Not of error," the inspector said. "Of omission." They stopped beneath a street lamp. Mr. Latham looked up at it, as though seeking confirmation. "We don't omit things," he said. "We deliver them." Inspector Perbrite nodded, "which is precisely why the letter troubles me." Mr. Latham hesitated. "Letters go astray," he offered. "Occasionally," the inspector agreed, "but rarely do they arrive without passing through your hands." Mr. Latham said nothing. His silence was careful, considered. "Tell me," Inspector Perbrite continued, "when was the last time you received post not intended for delivery?" Mr. Latham frowned. "That would be irregular." "And yet—" "There was something," he admitted slowly. "A week ago, an envelope without address or stamp left in the sorting tray." "And what did you do with it?" "I set it aside," Mr. Latham said, "for clarification." "Did clarification arrive?" "No." Inspector Perbrite waited. "It disappeared," Mr. Latham said at last. "I assumed one of the lads had dealt with it, and asked no questions." "There was nothing to ask," Mr. Latham replied, though without conviction. The inspector thanked him and turned away. By the time he reached the green, the light had thinned, the edges of things softening into suggestion. Miss Fenn's cottage showed.
No illumination.
This, too, he noted. He continued on, taking the longer route past the lane behind Ashley Cottage. A figure stood there, just beyond the reach of the nearest lamp. When the inspector approached, the figure stepped forward, revealing Mrs. Calder, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. "I thought it was you," she said. "So you did," he replied, "and waited." She smiled faintly. People notice more at night. Do they? They listen, she said. Even when they pretend not to. Have you been listening? He asked. She considered the question. I heard footsteps last night. Whose?
I couldn't say. At what hour? After midnight, she replied. Not long after. Inspector Purbright inclined his head. Did you mention this earlier? No, she said. It didn't seem necessary. And now, her
eyes met his. Now it does. They stood in silence for a moment, the night settling around them. Someone wanted Miss Fenn unsettled, Mrs. Calder said, but not harmed. Why not harmed? Because harm would invite certainty, she replied. And certainty is inconvenient. Inspector Perbrite smiled faintly. You think a great deal about such matters. In a village like this, she said, one must. She left him there, walking back toward the houses without looking behind. The inspector remained by the lane for several minutes, listening. Somewhere, a radio played softly. A door closed. Nothing more. Later, in his room above the King's Arms, Inspector Purbright finally opened his notebook. He wrote only a few lines, then stopped. What interested him was not what had been said, but what had been withheld. The postman had spoken.
Of routine. The postmaster of process. Mrs. Calder of footsteps.
None had mentioned the most curious detail of all. No one had spoken of surprise. In Lower Brindleford, surprise was rarely silent. Yet Miss Fenn had shown none. She had spoken of the letter as though its arrival were improbable, but not impossible, as though she had been waiting for it, without admitting the wait to herself. Inspector Perbrite closed the notebook. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere, an upstairs light went out. Another came on. The village continued its quiet negotiations with itself, each resident holding a piece of knowledge, each convinced it was insignificant. The inspector lay back on the bed, hands folded, listening to the building settle. The letter had not passed through the post, that much was clear, which meant it had passed through something else entirely. And whatever that was, it knew Lower Brindleford well enough to choose its moment. The flower show had been scheduled long before the letter arrived, which gave it a certain authority. Lower Brindleford respected events that resisted interference, and so by 10 o'clock the following morning, the village hall was already fragrant with damp soil, cut stems, and a competitiveness that prided itself on discretion. Inspector Perbrite arrived without ceremony, pausing just inside the door to take in the arrangement. Tables ran in neat rows, each crowded with careful achievements. Roses aligned like disciplined recruits, jars of marmalade glowing with suspicious perfection, cakes cut to reveal textures meant to suggest effortlessness. The inspector moved, slowly, hands behind his back, as though judging nothing at all. Miss Fenn was there, of course. She stood beside her entry, a modest arrangement of late summer asters, speaking to Mrs. Langley with an attentiveness that stopped short of warmth. Their voices were low, but not private. "I'm only saying," Mrs. Langley murmured, "that appearances matter." "They always do," Miss Fenn replied. "That doesn't mean they're reliable." Inspector Perbrite passed them without comment and continued along the tables. He stopped at the preserves, exchanged a word with Mr. Wilkes about acidity, and listened as Mrs. Calder explained the precise method by which her sponge achieved its lightness. Nothing on the surface related to the previous night. That, he reflected, was precisely the point. The first disruption came from the far end of the hall where the judging was underway. Voices rose, then steadied, then rose again. Inspector Perbrite drifted closer, arriving just as the disagreement
reached its most polite intensity. "I'm afraid I can't agree," said Mrs. Hargreaves, the judge for floral arrangements.
This entry doesn't meet the criteria. It meets them perfectly, replied Mrs. Denton, her smile rigid. It always has. Mrs. Hargreaves gestured toward the offending display. The balance is off. There's an excess of colour. Colour
"Is not excess," Mrs. Denton said. "It's expression." A small crowd gathered, drawn by the novelty of dissent. Inspector Purbright watched faces rather than flowers. Mrs. Denton's indignation was genuine.
Mrs. Hargreaves's resolve was careful, almost reluctant. Perhaps, Mrs. Calder suggested, we might consider context. Mrs. Hargreaves stiffened. Context is not part of the judging, isn't it? Mrs. Calder replied mildly. The inspector intervened then, not by speaking, but by stepping forward just enough to be noticed. The effect was immediate. Voices lowered, attention shifted. There seems to be some confusion, he said pleasantly. May I? Mrs. Hargreaves explained, with visible restraint, that Mrs. Denton's arrangement included blooms sourced from outside the village. This, she felt, violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the competition. Mrs. Denton protested. They were a gift. From whom? Mrs. Hargreaves asked. Mrs. Denton hesitated. A friend. Inspector Perbrite noted the pause. Rules, he said gently, are often clearer than motives. The matter was settled with a compromise that satisfied no one entirely. Mrs. Denton withdrew her entry. Mrs. Hargreaves adjusted her spectacles. The crowd dispersed, disappointment mingling with relief. Miss Fenn approached the inspector as he moved away. You enjoy these things, she said. I find them instructive, he replied. In what way? People defend what they believe they're entitled to, he said, even when it costs them. She considered this. And sometimes they withdraw rather than explain. Just so. They walked together toward the refreshment table. Miss Fenn poured tea with steady hands. You were watched, she said.
Quietly. Was I? Yes, she replied. From the moment you arrived? And you? I was included, she said. That's different. Inspector Perbrite glanced around the hall. Mrs. Denton stood alone now, her expression carefully
composed. Mrs. Calder spoke in low tones to Mr. Wilkes, who listened with the air of someone filing information for later use. Your letter, the inspector said, has altered the temperature. Miss Fenn met his gaze. It was meant to. By whom? She shook her head. Not yet. A sudden clatter drew their attention. A tray of cups had been dropped near the door. Apologies followed.
Laughter, a touch too loud, filled the gap. When the noise subsided, Inspector Perbrite noticed that Mrs. Denton had left. She didn't stay for the results, Miss Fenn observed. No, he agreed. She withdrew early. Miss Fenn's mouth
tightened. Some people dislike being examined. Others, the inspector said, dislike being ignored. They finished their tea in silence. Outside, the sun had begun to fade, clouds gathering with deliberate patience. As they stepped onto the green, Miss Fenn paused. There will be consequences, she said. Yes, Inspector Perbrite replied, but not the ones people expect. She looked at him as though weighing the statement. Then she nodded once and walked away. Behind them, the village hall emptied slowly, its brief disturbance already settling into anecdote. The flower show would be remembered for its disagreement, not its displays. Inspector Perbrite watched the door close. A small disagreement, he reflected, was rarely small. The day after the flower show dawned with a restraint that felt intentional. Lower Brindleford had agreed, tacitly, to behave itself. The disagreement had been absorbed, retold once or twice with suitable emphasis, then set aside in favour of more manageable concerns: weather, prices, the state of the footpath near the stream. Only the inspector seemed unwilling to let the matter settle. Inspector Purbright rose early and took his breakfast in the public room of the King's Arms, where the smell of toast mingled with furniture polish and old conversations. He ate slowly, reading nothing, his attention directed instead toward habit: who entered, who did not, and who paused as though reconsidering an absence. Miss Fenn did not appear. That, too, was noted. After breakfast, the inspector walked the length of the village without apparent destination. He paused at gates, studied hedges, and allowed himself to be overtaken by those who preferred a quicker pace. From a distance, people behaved differently. They forgot themselves, if only briefly. Mrs. Denton left her house at 9 precisely. She wore gloves, though the morning was mild, and carried a basket that appeared empty. Instead of turning toward the shops, she took the lane leading past the old rectory, her steps brisk, her gaze fixed ahead. Inspector Perbrite followed at a remove sufficient to suggest coincidence. She stopped at the rectory gate and waited. A few minutes later, Mr. Edwin Marsh appeared, keys in hand. He greeted her with a nod, unlocked the gate, and held it open. Their exchange was brief. No gestures, no visible agitation. Mrs. Denton passed inside. The gate closed. The inspector did not approach. He crossed the road instead, examining a notice that had been peeling for several months. After a suitable interval, Mrs. Denton emerged again, basket still empty, gloves still on. She walked back toward the village without looking around. At past 10, Inspector Perbrite encountered Mrs. Calder near the green. She was trimming a hedge that required no trimming. "You walk a great deal," she observed. "So do others," he replied. "Yes," she said, "but not always in the same patterns." He smiled. "Patterns are comforting. Only when they remain consistent," she said. "When they change, people notice." "Have you noticed changes?" he asked. She snipped a twig with unnecessary precision. "Miss Fenn has altered her routine." "In what way?" "She has stopped visiting Mrs. Langley in the afternoons." "Recently?" "Since the letter," Mrs. Calder said. Before that, they were inseparable. Inspector Perbrite nodded. "And Mrs. Langley?" "She pretends not to mind," Mrs. Calder replied, "which suggests she does." The inspector thanked her and continued on. He did not ask whether Mrs. Calder herself had altered any habits. He already knew the answer. By midday, the village had relaxed again, lulled by the inspector's apparent lack of urgency. This suited him. He took lunch at the cafe, listening as Mr. Wilkes explained to the proprietor the importance of margins, not merely financial, but social. "You give too much away," Mr. Wilkes said. "People take advantage." "People expect kindness," the proprietor replied. Mr. Wilkes lowered his voice. "Kindness is only effective when it's noticed." Inspector Perbrite filed this away. In the early afternoon, he paid a call on Mrs. Langley. She received him with her usual efficiency, though her eyes flicked more often than necessary toward the window opposite Miss Fenn's cottage. "She hasn't been by," Mrs. Langley said, before he could ask. "I know," he replied. "Well," she said, smoothing her apron, "people drift." "Do they?" he asked. "Or do they choose?" Mrs. Langley's lips pressed together. "If Dorothea believes I spoke too freely—" "Did you?" Mrs. Langley hesitated. I spoke as one does. And what is it one does? One speculates, she said, in private. Inspector Purbright thanked her and left. Outside he stood for a moment, observing Ashley Cottage from across the road. The curtains remained drawn, though it was full daylight. Late in the afternoon, he finally called upon Miss Fenn. She admitted him without surprise, ushering him into the sitting-room where everything lay exactly as it always had. The letter was not in evidence. You are being watched, she said as she poured tea. So are you, he replied. That has always been the case, Miss Fenn said. The difference is awareness. She handed him a cup. You've been observing habits. Yes. And
drawing conclusions.
Possibly, he said. She sat opposite him. Mrs. Denton came to see me this morning. I thought she might. She wanted reassurance. And did you give it? Miss Fenn considered this. I gave her courtesy. Not reassurance, he said. No, she agreed. That would have been dishonest. Inspector Perbrite took a sip of tea. There is a habit, he said, of mistaking proximity for loyalty. Miss Fenn's gaze sharpened. You think someone close to me wrote the letter? I think, he said carefully, that someone close to you knew precisely how it would be received. She was silent for a moment. Then, I once believed, she said, that silence preserved peace. And now? Now I see that it merely postpones discomfort. Outside, footsteps passed the cottage, slowing as they did so. Miss Fenn did not look up. Whatever comes next, she said, will not be dramatic. Rarely is, the inspector replied. It will be social, she smiled faintly. Those are the worst kind. When he left, the inspector did not walk away at once. He stood at the gate, noting the angle of the path, the visibility from neighbouring windows, the way the cottage sat just slightly apart from the others, neither isolated nor fully absorbed. Habits, he reflected, were rarely broken without cause, and when they were observed from a distance, they told far more than their owners intended. As he turned back toward the inn, the village resumed its gentle motion, unaware that several long-standing patterns were already beginning to fail. Change, when it came, was subtle enough to pass unnoticed by those who preferred certainty. Lower Brindleford did not erupt into alarm or speculation. Instead, it grew more precise. Statements became firmer, memories sharpened. Events that had previously been hazy acquired edges. Inspector Perbrite encountered this first. At breakfast, Mr. Wilkes, seated 2 tables away, leaned over with an air of helpfulness. I've been thinking about that night, he said. The
van. Yes, the inspector replied. I'm quite sure now it was blue, dark blue. You saw it yourself. Mr. Wilkes hesitated.
No, but when you think it through, it must have been. Inspector Perbrite nodded politely. Certainty, he reflected, was often retroactive. Later that morning, Mrs. Langley intercepted him outside the chapel. I should clarify something, she said. About the letter? I'm listening. I said Miss Fenn might have misplaced it herself. That was careless of me. She lowered her voice. I remember now hearing footsteps that night. Do you? He asked gently. Yes, quite distinctly. At what hour? Just after midnight, Mrs. Langley said promptly. And you mentioned this to no one? It didn't seem relevant at the time, she replied. But now it does, he finished. She smiled, relieved. By midday, the village possessed an abundance of perfect recollections. Everyone remembered something. The inspector listened, thanked, and retained none of it without reservation. He sought Miss Fenn in the early afternoon and found her in her garden, trimming back a rosebush with deliberate care. "They're remembering," she said, without looking up. "Yes," he agreed. "Very well." "It's unsettling," she continued. "I've lived here long enough to know when memory becomes performance." Inspector Purbright watched her hands. "Someone has made it safe to speak," he said. "And dangerous not to," she replied. She straightened and met his gaze. "Mrs. Denton believes she is being accused." "And is she?" Miss Fenn considered this. "Not directly. That can be worse," he said. They walked along the narrow path between the beds. Miss Fenn stopped beside a bench. "There was a meeting," she said. "Last night." He waited. "At the rectory?" she continued. "Informal. No decisions. Just agreement." "Agreement on what?" "On what we remember," she said. Inspector Perbrite sat. "Who attended?" "Mrs. Denton, Mrs. Langley, Mr. Marsh." She paused. Mrs. Calder did not. "And you?" "I was invited," Miss Fenn said. "I declined." He nodded. "That would have been noticed." "Yes," she said. It was meant to be. They sat in silence for a moment, the garden holding its breath around them. "What concerns you most?" the inspector asked. "That they are so certain," Miss Fenn replied. "Certainty closes doors." "And opens others," he said. She looked at him. "You think this is about more than the letter?" "I think," Inspector Perbrite said carefully, "that the letter has become permission." "For what?" "For people to resolve old discomforts," he said. "Preferably without consequence." Miss Fenn's mouth tightened. "There was nothing unresolved." "There rarely is," he replied, "until someone insists otherwise." As he left the cottage, the inspector encountered Mrs. Calder at the gate. She smiled as though they shared a private understanding. "They're talking themselves into corners," she said. "Yes," he replied, with remarkable enthusiasm. "They
want it settled," she continued. "Quickly." "Do you?" She considered this. "I want it understood." "Those are rarely the same thing," he said. She nodded. "That's why I'm not attending meetings." By evening, the pressure had become polite but persistent. Miss Fenn received 2 visitors she did not invite. Both came bearing concern. Both spoke of clarity. Neither mentioned the letter directly. "Inspector." Perbrite dined alone, listening to the cadence of voices around him. He noted how often Miss Fenn's name arose and how carefully it was framed. "She must be relieved," someone said, "to have it out." "She must feel exposed," said another. "She always kept herself to herself."
"That was her way." The inspector finished his meal and withdrew. Upstairs he reviewed his notes, sparse as ever. Facts were few, convictions abundant. He set the notebook aside and went to the window. Across the street, a light burned in Mrs. Denton's sitting room. Further along, Mrs. Langley's curtains twitched, then settled. Somewhere, a radio played softly, the same tune repeated twice. Perfect recollections, Inspector Perbrite reflected, were rarely born of truth. They were assembled piece by piece until they served a purpose. The trouble was not that people remembered too much, it was that they remembered together. And in Lower Brindleford, collective memory had a way of becoming decision. The following morning arrived with an air of usefulness. Lower Brindleford had reached the stage at which concern began to express itself as assistance, a development Inspector Perbrite regarded with particular caution. Kindness, once mobilized, rarely travelled alone. Miss Fenn was the first to experience it. By 9 o'clock, a basket had appeared on her doorstep containing apples, a loaf of bread, and a jar of honey whose label announced both purity and intention. There was no card. Miss Fenn examined the contents without touching them, then carried the basket inside and placed it on the sideboard, where it remained untouched for the rest of the day. Inspector Perbrite arrived shortly afterward, having observed the delivery from across the road. "They mean well," he said, as Miss Fenn poured tea. "Of course they do," she replied. "That's what makes it difficult." She gestured toward the basket. "Once one accepts these things, one is expected to accept the accompanying conclusions. And if one refuses? Then one appears ungrateful," Miss Fenn said. "Or guilty?" the inspector nodded. "Kindness that demands agreement is rarely generous." Later that morning, the kindness spread. Mrs. Langley arrived with a plate of scones, still warm, her manner composed but resolute. "I thought you might not feel like baking," she said. Miss Fenn thanked her and placed the plate beside the basket. Mrs. Langley lingered. "It must be a relief," she added. "Is it?" Miss Fenn asked. "Well," Mrs. Langley said carefully, "for things to be spoken of." Miss Fenn met her gaze. "Not everything improves with attention." Mrs. Langley smiled. The expression held a fraction too long. "We only want what's best." "For whom?" Miss Fenn asked. Mrs. Langley departed soon after, leaving behind a faint scent of flour and discomfort. Inspector Perbrite, who had remained silent throughout, rose to follow her out. "She wanted you to say something," he observed, once they were alone again. "Yes," Miss Fenn replied. "Anything at all." "And you did not?" "No," she said. "Silence is still permitted?" "Barely," he replied. By midday, the basket on the sideboard had been joined by flowers, a casserole, and an envelope containing
vouchers for the cafe.
None bore names. Miss Fenn regarded the collection with a mixture of irritation and weary amusement. "They are organizing my acceptance," she said. "Into what?" the inspector asked. "Into their version of events," she replied. He considered. "This. You are being offered absolution." "I have not asked for it." "Absolution is rarely requested," he said. "It's imposed." That afternoon, Inspector Purbright encountered Mrs. Calder near the green, watching the steady traffic of goodwill with a critical eye. "They've decided she's fragile," Mrs. Calder said. "And you?" "I think she's being managed," she replied. "There's a difference." "You've not contributed," he noted. Mrs. Calder smiled thinly. "I prefer my kindness without witnesses." "Wise," he said. She leaned closer. "They're planning something." "What sort of thing?" "A gathering," Mrs. Calder replied. "Nothing formal. Just enough people to make it inevitable." Inspector Perbrite nodded. "And Miss Fenn?" "She's expected," Mrs. Calder said, "whether she attends or not." The inspector returned to the King's Arms as the afternoon wore on. Conversation there had taken on a charitable tone. "She's been through enough," someone said. "Still," another replied, "one must be practical." "What she needs," a third voice added, "is closure." Inspector Perbrite finished his tea and left without comment. He found Miss Fenn in her sitting room standing before the sideboard. "I won't eat any of it," she said. "No," he agreed. "You shouldn't." She turned to him. "They're preparing me." "For what?" "For agreement," she said. "For letting it be settled." "And will you?" Miss Fenn walked to the window and looked out at the street. "I accepted kindness once," she said quietly. "A long time ago. It cost me more than refusal ever would have." The inspector waited. "It was meant kindly," she continued. "It always is." "Do you know who wrote the letter?" he asked. "Yes," Miss Fenn said. "But knowing and proving are not the same. And do you intend to prove it? She shook her head. I intend to prevent something worse. He considered her profile, the set of her shoulders. Sometimes, he said, preventing harm requires discomfort. She smiled faintly. You're very good at making discomfort sound reasonable. It's a skill, he replied. As evening approached, the kindness reached its peak. Mrs. Denton appeared at the door, empty-handed but determined. I thought we should speak, she said. Miss Fenn did not invite her in. Mrs. Denton hesitated, then lowered her voice. People are worried. People are curious, Miss Fenn corrected. Mrs. Denton flushed. We only want to help. Then stop, Miss Fenn said evenly. The word landed with surprising force. Mrs. Denton stared, then nodded stiffly and left without another word. Inspector Purbright, observing from the far side of the room, noted the exchange with interest. They will not stop, he said, once the door had closed. No, Miss Fenn replied. They will escalate. Outside, footsteps moved past the cottage, slowing, then continuing. The village was adjusting its expectations. Inspector Perbrite gathered his coat. There will be a moment, he said, when their kindness demands a response. And what should I give them? Miss Fenn asked. He paused at the door. Understanding, he said, but not the kind they're offering. When he left, the sideboard remained crowded with gifts, untouched and accusatory. Miss Fenn stood alone in the quiet room, aware that generosity had become its own form of pressure. In Lower Brindleford, kindness was never simple, and when it became inconvenient, it was often dangerous. Certainty arrived in Lower Brindleford the following day with remarkable efficiency. By mid-morning it had been shaped, shared, and refined into something that resembled conclusion. Inspector Perbrite observed its progress with the same care he had given to uncertainty, noting how swiftly one replaced the other. It began, as such things often did, with agreement. Mrs. Langley and Mrs. Denton were seen together outside the post office, their heads inclined, their expressions sober but purposeful. Mr. Wilkes joined them briefly, contributed a sentence or two, and departed, with the air of someone relieved to have done his part. By the time the bakery bell rang for the fourth time that morning, the narrative had settled. Miss Fenn had received a letter connected to an old misunderstanding. Someone, long troubled, had sought closure. The delivery had been irregular, but the intention understandable. Miss Fenn, being private by nature, had reacted strongly. The village, being kind, had responded. Inspector Perbrite heard this version 3 times before noon, each telling smoother than the last. He encountered Mrs. Calder near the green, standing, apart from the small groups that formed and reformed with quiet industry. They've decided, she said. Yes, he replied, quite thoroughly. They're proud of it, she added, as though reaching agreement were a civic duty. He smiled faintly. Agreement is comfortable. It spares effort. And responsibility, she said. The inspector left her and walked toward Ashley Cottage. He did not intend to knock. He had learned that Miss Fenn's door attracted attention even when unopened. Instead, he paused across the road, observing the steady flow of neighbours who slowed as they passed, some glancing toward the windows, others making a show of not doing so. Mrs. Langley emerged just as he turned away. "Inspector," she said, "I was hoping to see you." "Were you?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "I think matters have resolved themselves." "So it seems," she clasped her hands. "We spoke with Miss Fenn this morning, briefly." "And?" "She didn't contradict us," Mrs. Langley said, "which I take as acceptance. Inspector Perbrite regarded her thoughtfully. Or exhaustion, Mrs. Langley frowned. She didn't deny anything. No, he agreed. She rarely does. Mrs. Langley's expression hardened slightly. We can't force her to explain herself. Of course not, he said. That would be improper. But silence invites interpretation, she continued. It always has, the inspector replied. Mrs. Langley looked relieved. Then you agree? I agree, he said carefully. That interpretation is taking place. She nodded, satisfied, and moved on. Inspector Purbright continued toward the inn. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from concern to reassurance. It's all rather sad, someone said. But understandable. She kept things bottled up, another replied. Best to let it rest now. The inspector ordered tea and listened without comment. In the early afternoon, Miss Fenn sent for him. He found her seated in her sitting room, the sideboard now cleared. The basket and its contents were gone. You've disposed of the evidence, he said lightly. I've returned what wasn't mine, she replied, with thanks. And the letter? She gestured toward the table. It lay there, unopened, as though newly arrived. They think it's settled, she said. Yes. They think I've accepted their version. And have you, Miss Fenn? Folded her hands. I've accepted that they won't wait. For what? For permission, she said. They've given themselves that. Inspector Perbrite considered her. Certainty has a way of doing that. She leaned back. You warned me, I did. And yet, she continued, you haven't corrected them. No, he agreed. Not yet. She looked at him sharply. Why not? Because, he said, they are still speaking. And when they stop? Then, the inspector replied, they will listen. Miss Fenn smiled faintly. You're asking me to endure this.
I'm asking you to let it finish, he said. She was silent for a moment. They've chosen a culprit. Have they? Yes, she said. Me. Inspector Perbrite shook his head. No, they've chosen a resolution. You're incidental. She
laughed quietly. That's worse. Outside, voices passed the window, confident and unguarded. They're wrong, Miss Fenn said. Yes. And they're certain. Yes, she met his gaze. Certainty is dangerous. Only, he replied, when it arrives too easily. He rose to leave. What will happen? She asked. They will attempt to formalize it, he said. A meeting, a statement, something read aloud. And if I refuse to attend? They'll proceed without you, she nodded. Then I shall attend. Inspector Perbrite paused at the door. You needn't speak. I know, she said. But I might. As he stepped outside, the inspector felt the village settle into its chosen understanding. Doors closed with confidence, conversations shortened. The matter, everyone agreed, was nearly over. He walked slowly toward the green, hands behind his back, listening to the sound of certainty moving from house to house. It was always like this, he reflected. When answers came too quickly, they rarely belonged to the right question. And in Lower Brindleford, the most dangerous moment was not doubt, but the instant everyone agreed, there was nothing left to doubt at all. The meeting was arranged with an efficiency that suggested it had been anticipated,
rather than proposed.
Notices appeared on the church board and the post office window by mid-morning, written in the careful hand usually reserved for rota changes and charity collections. That it concerned Miss Fenn was not stated. That it concerned everyone was implied. Inspector Perbrite attended without arriving. He positioned himself instead at the edge of the green, where the path curved just enough to allow observation without participation. From there, he watched people gather in small, deliberate groups, each arrival greeted with a nod that carried more meaning than courtesy required. Miss Fenn arrived alone. She crossed the green at an unhurried pace, her posture composed, her attention apparently fixed on the church door ahead. Several conversations paused as she passed. Others lowered their voices. No one addressed her directly. Inside, the hall filled quickly. Chairs scraped. Coats were folded. The air took on the familiar density of shared intention. Inspector Purbright remained outside. He could hear the murmur through the open windows, the cadence of voices settling into expectation. He recognized the tone well enough to reconstruct the content without difficulty. Mrs. Langley would begin. She always did. Calm, reasonable, concerned. Mrs. Denton would add clarification. Mr. Wilkes would provide context. Mr. Marsh would confirm precedent. Agreement would follow, not unanimously but sufficiently. Someone would mention the letter obliquely. Someone else would stress discretion. There would be sympathy. There would be relief. What interested the inspector was not what was said, but how carefully it would be framed to avoid contradiction. He moved closer to the window. "Only trying to help," Mrs. Langley was saying. "No accusation," came Mrs. Denton's voice. "Just understanding. Best for everyone," Mr. Wilkes added. Inspector Perbrite listened. Inside, Miss Fenn sat near the back, hands folded in her lap. She did not speak. Several people glanced toward her, then away again, reassured by her silence. The matter progressed smoothly. It was at this point, precisely when agreement had achieved comfort, that Mrs. Calder spoke. She had not been expected to. "I wonder," she said, who exactly this understanding is for." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. A cough was suppressed. Mrs. Langley smiled, the expression slightly strained. "For Miss Fenn, of course." Mrs. Calder tilted her head. "Is it?" Mrs. Denton frowned. "We're all affected." "By what?" Mrs. Calder asked. "A letter none of us has read." There was a pause. Inspector Perbrite leaned closer to the window. Mr. Wilkes cleared his throat. "We know enough." Mrs. Calder looked at him. "Do we?" Silence followed, heavier this time. "It seems to me," Mrs. Calder continued, "that we've done a great deal of listening without noticing what we've chosen not to hear." Miss Fenn shifted slightly but did not speak. Mrs. Langley stiffened. "We're trying to prevent unpleasantness." "By finalizing it," Mrs. Calder replied, "without the inconvenience of uncertainty." A murmur moved through the room. "Inspector." Perbrite allowed himself a faint smile. Mrs. Denton spoke quickly. "This isn't the place for—" "For what?" Mrs. Calder asked. "For asking who benefited from silence in the first place?" The words landed with precision. Mr. Marsh leaned forward. "This is unnecessary." "Is it?" Mrs. Calder replied, "or merely late?" At the back of the room, Miss Fenn rose. The movement was quiet but unmistakable. Conversation ceased at once. "I think," Miss Fenn said, her voice even, "that I should clarify something." Mrs. Langley turned, relief and apprehension crossing her face in quick succession. "I did receive—"
"A letter," Miss Fenn continued.
"It arrived after midnight. It was delivered deliberately, and it was written by someone who believed they were entitled to my attention." A stir moved through the room. "It did not accuse me," she said. "It reminded me." "Of what?" someone asked. Miss Fenn did not answer immediately. She looked instead toward the front row, where Mrs. Denton sat rigidly. "Of a kindness," Miss Fenn said at last, "offered many years ago. One that came with conditions I did not fully understand
At the time.
Mrs. Denton's colour rose. "There is nothing criminal in kindness," Mrs. Langley said quickly. "No," Miss Fenn agreed. but there is something manipulative in generosity that expects silence in return. Inspector Purbright listened carefully. Miss Fenn continued. I was young, new to the village, grateful. I accepted help when it was offered. I did not realize that acceptance would be remembered differently by different people. Mrs. Denton stood. This is unfair. Is it? Miss Fenn asked gently. Or is it simply uncomfortable to hear aloud? The room held its breath. The letter, Miss Fenn said, was not a request for closure. It was a warning. A warning of what? Mr. Wilkes asked. That I was expected to agree, she replied. Again? Silence followed, this time
unsettled. Mrs. Calder nodded once, satisfied. Inspector Perbrite stepped back from the window. He had heard enough. Inside, voices began to overlap.
Explanations surfaced. Revisions were attempted. The certainty that had arrived so easily began to fracture under the weight of competing recollections. Miss Fenn did not remain to hear them. She left the hall quietly, crossing the green with the same measured pace she had brought with her. Inspector Perbrite fell into step beside her without comment. It won't be resolved tonight, he said. No, she replied. But it won't be decided without me either. They walked on in silence. Behind them the hall buzzed with recalibration. Outside, Lower Brindleford adjusted its understanding once more, less confidently this time. Inspector Perbrite glanced back once, then forward again. The matter, he reflected, had never been about the letter. It had been about who believed themselves entitled to define its meaning, and who had been listening closely enough to notice the difference. The village did not sleep easily that night. Lower Brindleford was accustomed to disturbance arriving from outside, weather, illness, the occasional stranger who stayed too long. Disturbance that rose from within required adjustment. Conversations replayed themselves in kitchens and bedrooms, altered slightly each time, softened in some places, sharpened in others. No one quite agreed on what Miss Fenn had said. Everyone agreed, however, that it had changed something. Inspector Perbrite spent the evening walking. He passed the church hall once more, now dark and closed, its windows reflecting only the lamplight and the uncertainty of those who had left it earlier. Further along, he noticed lights still burning where they usually did not. Mrs. Denton's sitting room, Mr. Wilkes's study, Mrs. Langley's front parlour. These were not signs of panic. They were signs of calculation. He returned to the King's Arms shortly before 10. The public room was quieter than usual. Talk had lost its confidence. Statements were now phrased as questions, and questions as recollections. Inspector Perbrite ordered tea and sat where he could hear without appearing to listen. She shouldn't have said it like that, someone murmured. It was bound to come out eventually. Still in front of everyone. Better that than whispers. The inspector finished his tea and went upstairs. Sleep came lightly. He woke once, briefly, to the sound of footsteps in the street below. Then again at dawn, when the village resumed its ordinary arrangements with unusual care. By mid-morning, a message arrived at the inn. Miss Fenn would be receiving visitors at 11. Anyone who wished to attend might do so. There would be tea. The phrasing was deliberate. It allowed dignity. It discouraged drama. Inspector Perbrite arrived early, though not first. Mrs. Calder stood by the gate, waiting with an expression of reserved interest. She's very brave, Mrs. Calder said. She's very tired, the inspector replied. They entered together. The sitting room had been arranged with precision. Chairs stood in a loose semicircle. The sideboard was bare. The letter lay on the table, unopened, its envelope carefully aligned. Miss Fenn greeted each arrival with the same courtesy, neither
warm nor distant. Mrs. Langley came. Mrs. Denton followed, pale but composed.
Mr. Wilkes arrived last, bringing with him the faint air of someone who hoped the worst had already happened. When everyone was seated, Miss Fenn poured tea. "I won't keep you long," she said, "but I think it best that something be made clear." She picked up the envelope. "This letter," she continued, "has been discussed widely, interpreted generously, misunderstood repeatedly." She paused, then looked around the room. "I intend to read it aloud." There was a collective
intake of breath.
No one objected. Miss Fenn opened the envelope and unfolded the paper. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady. The letter was not dramatic. It named no crime. It contained no accusation. It referred, in careful language, to assistance once given, to gratitude once accepted, and to expectations quietly formed as a result. It reminded the reader of discretion. It suggested, politely, that public discussion would be regrettable. When she finished, Miss Fenn folded the letter again and placed it on the table. No one spoke at first. Then Mrs. Denton cleared her throat. "I never meant—" "I know," Miss Fenn said gently. "You meant to help." Mrs. Denton's voice trembled. "You didn't say no?" "No," Miss Fenn replied. "I said thank you." "That's not the same thing," Mr. Wilkes said quietly. "No," Miss Fenn agreed. "It isn't." Mrs. Langley spoke then, her tone careful. "We assumed—" "Yes," Miss Fenn said. "You did." Silence followed, less hostile now, more thoughtful. Inspector Perbrite, seated near the window, watched the change take place. This was not confession, it was recalibration. The letter, Miss Fenn said, was not an attempt to shame me, it was an attempt to ensure I remained predictable. Mrs. Calder nodded once. "I won't pretend," Miss Fenn continued, "that I handled things perfectly in the past. I accepted kindness without examining its cost, but I will not accept obligation disguised as concern." She looked at Mrs. Denton, not unkindly. "Nor will I carry it alone." Mrs. Denton lowered her eyes. "I didn't realize," she said. "Truly?" "No," Miss Fenn replied. "You didn't want to, that was all." No one argued, no one pressed further. The room seemed to exhale. Tea was drunk. Plates were passed. Conversation returned cautiously to safer ground. Weather, gardening. The state of the lane near the stream. When people left, they did so quietly with a restraint that suggested effort rather than indifference. Inspector Purbright rose last. Outside, Miss Fenn walked with him to the gate. "They'll talk?" she said. "Yes," he replied, but differently. "And the letter?" "It's finished," she said. "It said what it can." Inspector Perbrite nodded. "It often helps to hear something aloud." She smiled faintly. "You knew how this would end." "I knew," he said, "that it wouldn't end with certainty." She considered this. "Thank you." "For what?" "For listening," Miss Fenn replied. He inclined his head and walked away. By evening, Lower Brindleford had settled again. Not into agreement, but into something quieter and more durable. Understanding had not arrived all at once. It had been distributed unevenly but fairly, and would take time to be absorbed. The letter lay back on Miss Fenn's table, no longer an intrusion, merely an object. Its power had been spent in daylight, among witnesses. Inspector Perbrite packed his bag. That night, when he left the following morning, there was no farewell committee, only the usual nods. the usual small courtesies. The village, satisfied that it had survived its own attention, returned to watching itself from a safer distance. And Lower Brindleford, which preferred its mysteries resolved quietly, did not speak of the letter again.